Hi, I'm Lucy Edwards. I'm the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Coordinator for the Children's Safeguarding Partnership. You've just heard a little bit about what a CSPR is, why we do them, how we do them. On the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about some regional serious case reviews and CSPRs and the key learning from those. And you'll see that these have been chosen because these have themes that we see really often here in Sandwell. One thing I will say before we start is that we could talk about each of these individual cases all day. So just to be clear, these are the key points from these reviews. Please do go on their website, whether it's Dudley, Wolverhampton, Sandwell and so on, if you want to see the review in full. The other thing I'd say as well is you'll already have heard some difficult things today. You're not going to hear anything any easier on these next couple of slides, I'm afraid. So just a reminder to everybody to practice self-care, and if there is something that you're finding particularly difficult, please do feel free to take 5 minutes, or please do speak to the trainers afterwards for a debrief. You're also welcome to have my email details as well from the trainers if you wanted to have a debrief and talk through a little bit further. Okay, firstly on this slide then we're going to talk about a little boy called Jeremiah Regis. He was 2 years old when he died back in 2016. He was a little boy from Wolverhampton, and his cause of death was a serious blow to the stomach which caused internal bleeding. When he was examined after he died, he was found to have over 100 other injuries across the body, numerous bruises, fractures, bite marks and so on. So really clear that this little boy had been seriously physically abused over a prolonged period of time. The serious case review found 2 areas where professionals could have displayed greater curiosity when they were working with Jeremiah and his family. The first one was around understanding what religion meant to the family. So when stepdad, who inflicted the fatal injuries, when he was interviewed afterwards, he referenced his Christian faith and said it was his belief that he needed to use physical chastisement when Jeremiah misbehaved, as he put it, and he needed to use that to toughen children up. There's also a video that's still available online of mother when she's 4 months pregnant with Jeremiah, and she's having an exorcism because she was believed to be cursed. So she believed she needed to have this ritual to stop her passing the curse down to Jeremiah, basically. So it's really important with whatever family you're working with, whatever their race, faith, cultural background, whether they have religious beliefs or whether they don't, it's really important to understand how that might impact on their choices, behaviours and decisions, and how they might do something completely differently to what you might do based on your own set of values and experiences, and whether you've got a faith that you follow or not. So really, really important to understand how that might impact on a child. Another area where professionals could have shown greater curiosity was around the role of stepfather. So agencies knew that mom had got this boyfriend, had got this partner living with the family, but didn't really know anything about him, not his role in the family, his background, even much about who he was at all. And that's something that we see a lot here in Sandwell. We talk about having invisible men. So whether it's dad, stepdad, granddad, uncle, whoever it is, there's a lot of focus on the moms to safeguard, or the female carer, to safeguard, improve outcomes and so on. So it's really important with any family that you're working with to try and think flexibly about how you can conduct visits or meetings to try and encourage both parties to engage, because whoever's in that child's household in that caring role is equally accountable for safeguarding that child. Whether you've got a mum and dad, 2 mums, 2 dads and so on, they are equally accountable for safeguarding that child and making any changes that need to be made. So really important to think about how you can include both parents and carers in any work that you're doing with a family. The second one on the screen now is a little boy called Hakeem Hussein. He was 7 years old when he died in Birmingham back in 2017. So his cause of death was a severe asthma attack. He was found outside a flat that he'd been staying at with his mum the night before. It wasn't their home, they were kind of moving between properties at that time. Mum was heavily under the influence of drugs the night before, so she'd allegedly smoked 3 bags of heroin. When she woke up, realised Hakeem was gone and went outside, and obviously at some point during the night he'd left the property, and had sadly passed away outside. Hakeem had been placed on a child protection plan just a few days before he died, and when professionals got together in that case conference, they expressed their real fears for Hakeem's safety, and whether there were any protective factors really for him in residing with Mom. There was a meeting planned with Hakeem's mother on the Monday morning, to really say, this is Last Chance Saloon, this is what needs to change. That is sadly the morning that Hakeem was found deceased. So there's a real backstory for Hakeem, which is characterised by chronic neglect, mainly associated with the substance misuse by his mum. At one point she was reported to be spending about £55 a day on her habit, and she'd actually modified one of Hakeem's asthma inhalers to smoke drugs. Now this is a little boy, who's got no food in the cupboards at home, no gas, electric, no place to call his home really, because all of the money that was coming to Mum was going on her drug habit. He'd been identified as a gifted and talented child, but because his school attendance became so poor over the years, this really affected his academic progress, and when he did attend school he was often late, and displayed really challenging behaviours in school, which really was from his frustration because he couldn't figure out what was going on because he'd missed so much school. He hadn't got those relationships with his people in his class and with his teachers and so on, so had a real negative impact on his expected achievement when he started school. Educational neglect is something that we really need to focus on here in Sandwell, because if a child isn't being taken to school, that is neglecting their educational rights. We've launched a briefing here in Sandwell back in September 2022 with the key message that school attendance is everyone's business, and it highlights what any practitioner, regardless of their role or agency, can and should do if they're concerned that a child isn't being taken to school. And I'd really encourage people to think about the short and long-term consequences of that. So if that doesn't change, how is that going to affect that child in the short term? How is that going to affect their long-term prospects if they're missing a lot of school as well? I will also draw people's attention to the fact that we've got a multi-agency neglect strategy and lots of associated training, because I think practitioners in Birmingham really struggled to kind of assess where that significant harm threshold for neglect was. And it's really important that all agencies across Sandwell take neglect seriously and realise that it can be a potentially fatal form of harm for children. We've also got a tool in Sandwell at the moment, the Graded Care Profile 2, which can be used by any agency to assess neglect. So if you've not already been on that training, I would strongly advise everybody to do so. And I'll just finish this bit by using something that Hakeem himself said in some direct work with school. So at the age of 6, Hakeem said, "I'm 5% happy, 100% angry and 1000% scared. My mum sleeps all day and no one takes me to school. I take care of myself whilst mum is asleep." Okay, so the next one is one from our neighbours in Dudley. This is child L. This was a baby who was just less than 3 months old when they died back in 2018. The cause of this baby's death was airway obstruction in the context of co-sleeping. So on the night they passed away, they'd been sleeping on the sofa with their parents and an older sibling as well. Both parents were tested to see if they'd been under the influence of drink or drugs when the baby died. They weren't, but there was clear evidence in the home of recent usage of both alcohol and drugs. When the home was visited after the baby had died, the conditions were found to be extremely poor. So bearing in mind you've got a newborn baby in this house, there was no evidence of baby bottles. They'd got a sterilising unit that was dry and covered in mould, mouldy food on the floor. The beds were really dirty, stained with no covers on, which suggests why they weren't using the bed to sleep in. As part of the review, they did like a learning event where all practitioners who'd been involved with the family before the baby died came together, and it was established that about 8 to 10 days prior to the baby dying, they'd received a routine home visit by health practitioners, and it was felt that it was unlikely that the home had deteriorated to that extent in such a relatively short space of time. So one thing that this review identified was that general like tolerance and acceptance of that as a condition for those children to be living in, and how easy it is as practitioners, regardless of your role, to become desensitized to some of the houses that we go in, the people that we meet that come into school, or whatever your role is. It's very easy to kind of normalize that when you see lots of different families. So the review really focused on what professionals can do to kind of continually check themselves and assess themselves, using things like supervision with managers to really challenge your assessment and judgment. And as managers, that's something you really should be doing with any staff that you supervise, whether that is an employed member of staff or a volunteer or a student. We talk about being non-judgmental in our role, but you do make judgments all day every day with the different families that you work with, and you might walk through the door one day and have one assessment of a situation. It might be completely different the next day. It might be 6 weeks later that it's completely different, and that's for better and for worse as well. So really important to not just make your decision on day one and stick with that. Look at what's changing and what's happening as you work with different families. And I'd also say to use your colleagues as well. So I'm from a family support background, and we always talked about beware of being sandwellised. So we'd take volunteers or students out on home visits with us, or do a joint visit with like a health visitor, for example, or an outreach worker from a school, because they might have a totally different take on it than you would. And it comes back to what I said earlier about your values and experiences that can play a big part in how you view a situation as well. So please always be mindful and reflect on situations, and being aware of that desensitisation risk. Okay, the next two are the first CSPRs that or some of the first CSPRs that we published here in Sandwell. The first one is a baby known as RS who was seriously injured in 2019 when they were 4 months old. They received these serious injuries whilst they were in the care of parents, and fortunately the baby has made a much better recovery than anticipated at the time this happened. Both parents admitted to causing or allowing harm to the child, and have subsequently been imprisoned as well. This child's story is characterised by things like concerns about weight gain after birth, really late being registered with the GP after birth, late for development checks and immunisations, and that was a pattern that had been the case with an older sibling as well. Dad had also moved to the area from another part of the country and had got some justice orders that he was serving at the time for drugs offences. They never successfully followed him to Sandwell from the area that he came from. So although there was some communication, it was never fully picked up this end, meaning that Dad never actually completed those orders that he'd been served, and that didn't come to light until he was arrested in connection with the injuries to RS. A couple of weeks before RS was taken to hospital with these injuries, he went for with his mum for a routine baby clinic, and Mum said, "Oh, looks like there's a tiny mark on his chest. I don't know like where that's come from." So baby was examined. There was evidence of a really like a tiny little scratch on his chest, but otherwise appeared healthy, well. Mum couldn't explain, where it had come from. And then a couple of weeks later, this baby's in hospital with massive non-accidental injuries, and it was reflected on as part of the review as to whether that was, a cry for help. Had Mum done something to the baby? Did she know someone else had done something? Ultimately, we will never know the answer to it. But I cannot stress enough how important it is if ever you're presented with a non-mobile child, a baby, who can't readily tell you whether something has happened or not. Please always ask the parent or carer for an explanation if it's safe to do so and won't put the child at further risk. Please always carefully document it in records, and please always seek advice or guidance from your line manager, safeguarding lead, whoever it is in your organisation. I'm sure there are many times where there is a completely innocent explanation, but there's every chance that there could be something sinister happening as well. And I would also say this doesn't just apply to babies. Some older children can't talk or are non-verbal because of additional needs, diagnosis, and so on. So any child who is non-mobile or non-verbal, who can't tell you how something might have happened, really important to follow the steps that I just said as well. We did update our regional practice guidance, which is available on the West Midlands Child Protection website as well. So please do go and have a look at that. That's for any injury to a non-mobile child under the age of 2. We've also launched something called the ICON programme here in Sandwell. So that is to support new parents in those early days after a baby's been born around coping with crying. So we've got the details of the websites which can be shared with everybody. It's a really useful resource as well. And I would say as well, we know that when families move to different areas, that's the time when children can become really vulnerable and where they can easily get lost. Don't think it was necessarily the case with this child, but we do know that sometimes families move areas to avoid attention. So it's not enough just to ping off a referral or some information to another area and hope that's the end of it. Really important to follow that up with phone calls, emails, and make sure that the person who's picking up your information knows what the situation is. And it's the same when a child's moving into the area. Have you got all of the information you need to understand what's going on with that family and pick up from where they left off? Finally, then, this is SC. This was a 17-year-old who was sadly murdered back in 2021 in Smethwick. This young person was stabbed to death by a peer who has since been jailed for life. SC had got a history, a long history of involvement with statutory services, concerns around neglect from the very earliest years of his life. And then as he kind of hit those teenage years, 13, 14, we really saw a big sort of escalation in concerns around exploitation, links to local gang and county lines activities, increased missing episodes and increased criminal incidents as well, where SC was recorded as both a victim and a perpetrator. But when I'm saying perpetrator, I want to be really clear that this young person was being exploited at the time. This CSPR was a little bit different, so we did this as a thematic review, looking at some of the really key themes that came out just after SC had died. And one thing that this review explored was around disproportionality and really exploring that disparity and why do we see an over representation of black boys being excluded from school, and why do we see an over representation of black youths in our youth justice system as well. I also want to be clear, this isn't just a Sandwell issue, this is very much a national issue. But what it found was that we really needed to do a lot of work in Sandwell around our data collection, because in some areas we couldn't even say the ethnicity of children and families who were accessing our services. Really important to ask those basic questions when you start working with a family. Otherwise, how are you ever going to understand their identity and understand how to engage with them based on their background and their views and their wishes and so on. It also identified as well that we need to do a lot more work in our early help space, because we often see that black and minoritised ethnic families aren't engaging in that space. So we're not seeing these families until we're at the crisis level, at the statutory intervention level. We want to make sure that any family can access that support at the earliest possible stage. And we also want to make sure that our professionals feel culturally competent and capable of engaging with any family from any background in an appropriate, sensitive and creative way. So we're launching our cultural competence framework and associated training to really support practitioners with that. And I'll just end this bit by sharing some research and a statistic that came out as part of the review that I felt was really striking. So a black Caribbean boy who's eligible for free school meals and who's got an additional need is 168 times more likely to be excluded from school than a white British girl with no additional needs and no access to free school meals. Okay, well, I've already talked about quite a few of these key themes in the slide that we've just covered, but just to reiterate, these are some of the themes that we see repeatedly across all of our multi-agency work in Sandwell, whether that's CSPRs, rapid reviews, audits, and so on. So just wanted to focus on these and bring them to your attention. I've said around invisible men and us not always seeing the role of dads, granddads, boyfriends, whoever it is, that male carer in assessments and direct work that we're doing. So as I said earlier, it's really important to think flexibly, work flexibly, and think, how can I get this male's role in, their views on what's happening, and really, help to get them on board to make a difference and safeguard their child as well. One thing that we don't always see is that so what factor. So we can often see that, and it's really easy, thinking back to my time as a practitioner, it's really easy to list the things that we think are working well, that are the protective factors, and the things that we're worried about. But so what? What's going to happen if that doesn't change? So if you've got a child that isn't going to bed until 1 in the morning, or isn't getting to school until 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning, has never got the right clothing on for the weather, they're going out in the winter with no coat on, what impact is that going to have on that child in the short term? What might that mean for them in 10 years' time? If they're missing so much school, what does that mean for their potential job prospects one day? And those are the kind of things where, if you're looking at what threshold, where does this sit? Those are the kind of things that help you make that decision on what support that child and family needs. I've already said about that cultural awareness and understanding of what race, faith, what a cultural background means to that family, how it might make them think and do things differently to how you would, and that you really need to understand that when you're working with a family in order to get the best out of them and support them to make changes in a sensitive and respectful way. And that applies to any family that you work with, whether they're Bangladeshi, white British, Hungarian, whatever they are, that is important for any family that you work with. You'll already talk about GDPR throughout today's course, but just to be really clear that it's not a barrier to information sharing when you've got safeguarding concerns and you're worried that a child is at risk of significant harm. It is not a barrier to that. Really important as well, we talk about information sharing all the time in our local and national reviews as well, but I would always use the motto, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So always think, even if you've got the most basic bullet point notes in your record when you're running between visits and meetings, it's really important to have that paper trail. You could be asked about something that happened with a family 2 years ago, 3 years ago, how are you ever going to remember that without some kind of paper trail to follow? But I would always say as well, being mindful in what you're recording as well, that at any point in that future, that child or family could ask and have the right to see their file and what was written about them. So really important to consider that as well. Thinking as well around neglect and how that can manifest in lots of different ways in a family. It can also have a real impact, as we saw for Hakeem, on children who have got a chronic health condition. And I think one of the things with Hakeem was that when he was missing so much school, it was very easy to say, oh, this little boy's got really chronic asthma, that's probably why he's off. So to kind of make that assumption because a child has got an underlying issue and additional needs and so on. Any child who's got a health condition, especially something like asthma, should be managed and supported in an appropriate way. So it's really important not to kind of lose sight of that where there are neglect concerns, because that line can get very blurred as well. Making sure we understand the child's lived experience, so making sure that you're capturing what does the child think, what's their views, what do they want to happen, what makes them happy, what makes them sad, and also making sure you capture that for children who might not be able to talk to you. So we spoke earlier about non-mobile babies, non-verbal children. Got a lot of children in Sandwell who don't speak English as a first language. There's lots of ways to try and capture that child's views by looking at their expressions, their body language, and so on. So sometimes being creative in how you read what a child's view and wish might be. I've mentioned as well about transferring information when families cross borders. We know that children can be really vulnerable and can get lost when families move areas. So it's important that we as practitioners don't let that happen, and that we make sure we've got all the information we need when a child moves into the area, and that everything has been passed on when a child does move. That also applies for things like moving schools, even within Sandwell, making sure that all of that information moves across with that child and doesn't get lost, because then we know it just leads to start again syndrome. Families become frustrated with us having to tell the same story over and over again. So it's just really important to make sure that we share that information. And I'll just finish by saying, a really clear reminder about if you're presented with a child who's got an unexplained injury, if that's a non-mobile baby, please do always document it and always seek advice from your safeguarding lead.